Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we'll round up the story of Norway in World War II by exploring what happened in the country after the Germans conquered it, from raids to resistance to liberation. Hi Jesse, another week, another podcast. Here we are again. As I just said, Norway part 3. So we really have to finish the story now. So in the previous 2 episodes, we talked about the invasion, we talked about the Allied and also the German strategic plans, some of the tactical actions, why it went well in some areas for the Germans, not so well in other areas for the Germans, and vice versa when you look at the Allies. But this is all done now. So the Germans are now in command of the country, as we said in our last episode. So again, we now need to bring it forward and have a look at what happens in Norway, because the war is not over in Norway, is it? There's still a lot of stuff happening. There is basically 5 years of occupation we're looking at now. So in many ways, for the Norwegians, the war is only really beginning now. So the fighting period itself, as we explained last time, was quite short. So there is not an awful lot there going on in most places. And again, we talked about the examples, in particular Narvik, of course. But now something else happens. So, Jesse, where do we take it? Where do we start to begin with? It's a big one, isn't it? Where do we pick up the story here?
Well, there's a few themes that we're going to get into, I think, in this Norway post-1940 conquest. We mentioned a couple of them off the top. Resistance is one, which we'll try to put into some context and not let the drama of resistance run away with us, even though it's always very symbolically important to every society. You know, as historians, we've got to try to be a bit sober about it and look at it in its context. There's also the political side, and of course, there's also the further military action. So when the Germans arrive, one of the reasons why they've taken Norway, it's not only to secure their iron ore route for Swedish iron ore being exported through the port of Narvik, it's also to be able to have these bases to strike at the British. So now they're going to take advantage of these Norwegian fjords where they can hide surface ships, where they can send some subs, but also air power is quite key. So they're going to make use of Norway's very, very long coastline stretching across the North Sea, but also up towards the Arctic, because Norway has a very long tail on it that stretches right around above Sweden and Finland and gets right up to the Soviets, essentially. And so when the Soviet Union enters the war, the Germans are going to be able to strike at British convoys. There's a recent movie, I think, that came out recent in the last few years, I don't know exactly, called The Arctic Convoy, that really put these British Arctic convoys going to Murmansk. That's the big Soviet port in the north. Maybe some of them also went to Archangel up there, which is another Arctic Soviet port that's only available part of the year. And so the Germans are going to try to harass those convoys and sink as many ships in them as they can with air power based out of Norway. Primarily Norway in any case. So this is one of the big elements. You have the Luftwaffe really trying to make use of the Norwegian airfields that they've conquered in 1940. I'll admit, I don't have the world's greatest expertise on the details of those operations, but that's the gist of what the Luftwaffe is doing from Norway, trying to get at those convoys.
Absolutely. And not only are they trying to get at these convoys, but it all really starts with this idea of the Battle of Britain. So the Germans start to invest into these airfields. So for example, the airfield at Sola, which is at Stavanger, that becomes a major military airport for the Germans. Had been one before the war as well for the Norwegian Air Force, but now it's a big one. And they actually put quite a strong air base there and quite a few of the bombers. And the idea behind it, of course, is that when you go and fight the battle for Britain, these bombers will be able to fly across the North Sea, a little bit like the Vikings, you might say, in the old days in the longboats, and get all the way to the east coast of the UK. And why is that important? Because you have the industrial areas in the northeast, and these are the bits that they want to bomb. In addition to that, what you also achieve, of course, by sending bombers up there is that you, for a better term, confuse the British air defense, and they will have to move fighters from the southern bit, where the main battle is taking place, the southern part of the UK, all the way to the north to protect the industrial centers there and also the population. So that makes it easier then for the Germans to attack in the south. So you begin to see why the Germans think that attacking in this area is a good idea. The problem, of course, the Germans are facing here is that the distance is quite big. So the bombers can get to the east coast of the UK, but the German fighters can't. And that is a huge problem, because the moment you then have these German bombers arriving over the east coast of the UK, and should they get intercepted by British fighters, again, a bit like the Battle of Britain, you've got some Poles there later on, lots of Canadians as well. There's a big airfield outside of Harrogate where you have a big airfield, and it's a training installation as well. And lots of the people shot down and died because they came down in accidents are actually Canadian. So that's another interesting little story. But once the Germans are intercepted by these, let's call them British for a better term, it makes it easier. These fighters, then of course a lot of the German bombers get shot down, which means that in the end, the Germans realize that just sending these bombers over is not a clever idea. And during the Battle of Britain, so it's all within that context, they actually stopped these attacks as well. So again, the German attack here has failed. They then have these long-range reconnaissance planes. They don't have that many, the Germans, and the ones that they do have are not really properly designed for this. It's mainly it's called a Condor WW2, which is an old passenger plane, which they use for long distance reconnaissance, trying to find the convoys. Some of these are stationed there as well. And then, of course, as you already said, if they manage to find a convoy, and you can then send out the bombers again, the Kampfgeschwader, as they were called. So these are the bombers that now, for example, also have torpedoes or normal bombs, dropping these on the ships as they're trying to go to the ports that you already mentioned. So that's the Air Force component. And of course, the other one is, and again, you talked about this already, is of course the Navy component. Again, rewinding a little bit, particularly in the early days, 1940. So this is before Germany has defeated France. So you need to get access to the North Sea and to the Atlantic, and you can outmaneuver the British blockade by going into Norway. Once France is there, France is in German hands. You've got the U-boat ports on the west coast, but this is still an important area, because you have the surface fleet. A lot of these ships are there because you can hide them quite well in the fjords. And of course, you can use them against these convoys that go to the places you mentioned, Arkhangelsk and Murmansk. Why do you use them there? Why do you not have them somewhere else? I think in the previous episode, you explained the Graf Spee disaster. So this is one of these German pocket ships that basically scuttles itself in South America. And the Germans have realized, this whole idea of sending these ships out to sink lots of cargo ships isn't really working. You can't really use them anywhere around France or something like this because of the air threat. So you send them to Scandinavia and to Norway, where the weather quite often is quite bad. So, and of course, it's also quite far for the Allies to get there. So the air cover is not as impressive, you might say. So that's why you've got a lot of these ships there. Probably the most famous one is the Tirpitz, which basically sits there. So the largest, biggest ship built by the Germans, and really doesn't do anything until it again, of course, gets sunk by the British from the air. So again, this whole idea of the surface fleet and the big ships in the German context is a bit of a non-starter, but it all in the planning all plays a very, very important role when you look at what Hitler, in particular the Navy, and also the Air Force think about Norway and why they want to get their hands on it. That again was quite a lot. I'm going to shut up now and throw it back to you, Jesse. What have I forgotten? What do you need to fill in, comment upon, or say, well, that was complete nonsense?
Perish the thought. of nonsense here on this podcast, of course. But what I'm struck when we talk about a couple of these examples, like the role of Norway-based German bombers during the Battle of Britain, trying to go without fighter escorts and bomb the northern parts of the UK, or the fact that these capital surface ships end up just sort of hanging out in Norwegian fords. This isn't a ringing endorsement of the efficiency of German strategy, right? So they spend all this effort capturing Norway. I should also mention that in the end, Narvik ceases to become as important of an export port for iron ore as the Germans expected it to be. So even there, they're not using Narvik for iron ore near as much as they had planned to and expected to when they were conceiving this plan to invade Norway. So here we have three examples: the iron ore, the air base to be used against Britain, and naval bases in Norway that are really not doing much for the Germans. So all that effort, and then of course, as I'm sure we will mention again throughout the course of this episode, then of course you have the huge German garrison that's there, which is like, if memory serves, something like at least 300,000 men who are sitting around in Norway not doing anything until the very end of the war. Now, in retrospect, I'm kind of happy that the Germans wasted all their resources there, because it made the Allies' lives that little bit easier. But if you look at it from a sort of strategic point of view, as is very often the case, the Germans are not that efficient in their strategic choices here. We talk a lot about German efficiency in life in general. We joke about it on the podcast. In some cases, it makes sense, and they are more efficient than the Allies. In other cases, they're actually less efficient, which is a luxury that they don't have given their resources. So, I also wanted to mention one of my colleagues who I regularly work with on projects. His grandfather was on the Tirpitz and serving on the Tirpitz when it got sunk, but he survived. So
that's lucky. That's very lucky. Mm-hmm.
Indeed, it's quite an interesting story. So I wanted to talk about a couple of other military-related things before we get to the sort of politics and resistance. I want to talk about a couple other instances, but that is skipping to later in the war, in 1944. If you don't mind, Matthias, I would skip there, because Norway is kind of, it is a sort of chip that seems to have so many uses. It's almost like a mirage, I think, in a way, of strategic potential. The Allies do try to make use of that in an operation called Fortitude. Now, Operation Fortitude, the idea here is in 1944, they want to try to deceive the Germans about D-Day. It's kind of clear that the Allies are going to invade France. This is not, you can't really trick the Germans into thinking that there's going to be no invasion, but they want to plant a few seeds of doubt as far as the details are concerned to help the chances of the Normandy invasion succeed. So they come up with this Operation Fortitude, deception, where they try to plant the idea of a fake army, for example, in the UK, led by Patton, who the Germans think very highly of because he's very aggressive, and so on and so forth. So there's this fake army that supposedly is going to land at Calais, not in Normandy. So to get the Germans to think, they're going to land in Calais and not in Normandy, so we'd better keep our troops up there, helps the Normandy invasion's chances, right? But another part of that was that the Allies tried to make the Germans believe that they would land in Norway and reconquer Norway in, I think it was supposed to be May 1944. So that, the Allies hoped, if the Germans would believe that they were going to land in Norway, the Germans would then miscalculate the timeline for any invasion of France. Because if the Allies were to have invaded Norway, they would have had to commit significant resources, naval, transport, landing ships, air, and they would not have been able to recalibrate their logistics, reposition all those assets, especially the landing craft, which is kind of in relatively short supply. They wouldn't have been able to do all that and invade France in June. So the Germans, according to this plan, deception plan, would have come to the conclusion, they're planning to invade Norway in May. That means we don't have to worry about a D-Day in France until well into July. And then, in theory, the Germans would be less prepared and caught off guard by D-Day. So you see Norway being used here, its presence, as actually to work against the Germans. Now, the Germans didn't fully take the bait on this one, partially in France, but with the Norway operation, they did send a few troops to Norway, but it wasn't like it didn't work to the max that it could have, let's say. To make a long story short, here's another instance, in fact, where Norway kind of works against the Germans almost, you could say. So I thought that was an interesting one.
Absolutely right. And don't forget, we did a podcast on this, on obfortitude and deception. So, dear listeners, if you want to hear a bit more about this and the Allied plans and the German reactions, it's all there. I can't remember which podcast it is, which number. We've done so many now. I think we're over 50 at this particular stage. So
it's one of the 53.
Don't ask me. So somewhere in the library, you will find it, dear listeners. But you're absolutely right. So they're trying to put some sort of, well, let's call it pressure onto the Germans. And they're doing it in this context. But it's also happening all the way through the war. So the Germans, for example, Hitler in particular, gets slightly worried in 1941, because in March 1941, there's a British raid, Operation Claymore, where some British and also Norwegian commandos basically raid. And the number of these happening all through the war. And this sends out the message to the Germans, in particular Hitler, who for some strange reason is obsessed with this whole Norway thing. That something is happening, that Norway is really important, that Norway is very important to the Allies as well, all that kind of stuff. And that is the reason, or one of the reasons, as to why they keep so many troops there. You already mentioned, so it's about 300,000. At the end of the war, it's actually even more. It's about 400 to 450,000 German troops stationed in Norway. And you just ask yourself why. I mean, that is really so completely barking mad. And you say, well, the idea was to continue the fight after Germany's been occupied or whatever. I mean, that wouldn't happen. Let's face it. So it's really quite strange. Why do they keep all these troops there all the time? You might now, of course, create the counter argument and say, in particular, when you look at the naval troops that are there, strong naval contingent, because you've got these naval ports. What would you do with them back, for example, in Germany in 1945? Because this is not the army. They're not trained in, urban fighting or something like this. So they probably, a lot of them would become cannon fodder. But there are exceptions to this, because you also have relatively combat experienced troops coming back from further north, say the Finland front, when they make their way back into Norway. So it's really a confusing and one that's never really been answered. So why? Why is that they keep all these troops there? And a number of times in the German High Command, when they meet with Hitler towards the end of the war, they also say, well, we've got all these troops sitting here. So it's a bit like the Kurland pocket in the modern day Baltic states. We need these troops there for the big counterattack. And you might even say, okay, in the Eastern Front, the Kurland pocket is fixing lots of enemy troops. But who are you fixing in Norway? Seals? I mean, it's really a bit silly, isn't it?
Polar bears. Polar
bears, there we go. Not penguins, they're the other end, aren't they? But you just think, why? It really does not make any sense. I mean, of course, I wouldn't complain if I got posted to Norway in, let's say, early 1944 from the Eastern Front.
I'd thank my lucky stars.
Exactly, but it just beggars belief as to why they leave all these troops there. As you say, really bad strategic decision on the German side. But as you already said, and I think you're absolutely right, German strategy in both world wars is really, really poor. So the Germans win a lot of battles. So they're very good at the operational stuff, perhaps even better at the tactical stuff. But then they're not really able to turn this into strategic victory, because strategic thinking in Germany at that particular time is very, very poor. And that is, I would say, the reason why they lose both world wars. And here, of course, in 1945, World War II. You're absolutely right. So strategy is nothing that the Germans really do at that particular time.
Well, I think that we just wrapped up the podcast. That's the
There
conclusion.
we are, done. Okay, we're done
That's
forever.
the final conclusion for this. It was a great run. Thanks for being with us, everybody. We've figured it out. We've figured out the two world wars. But in seriousness, I'm glad you mentioned the raids, because there were quite a few raids. For example, a part of Norway is off the mainland, so they also own these islands very far up towards the North Pole called Svalbard. It's a couple of islands there. The most famous one, as far as I know, at least the only one I really heard of, is called Spitzbergen. I'm pronouncing it German, but I guess there's probably a Norwegian variant. Apologies yet again for that. But anyway, the British commandos, they raid there a couple of times. They try to evacuate some Norwegian civilians, but they're also going there to destroy the coal mines, which raises another strategic question, because the whole idea of raiding is very dramatic. The Brits can be doing something when they're struggling and they've been thrown off the continent. But given the amount of training that goes into these commandos and special forces, does it then make sense to invest that in order to destroy a coal mine on a forlorn Arctic island? I mean, it's not like the Germans are running their Tiger tank factory on thanks to coal from Spitzbergen. So is it really worth it to do all these raids? Who knows, but they did raid several times, including up there at Spitzbergen. The Germans also launched an interesting small operation, let's say, called Operation Haudegen in fall 1944, but it doesn't have anything to do with special forces per se. It's about weather. And this is an interesting little tangent of the kind that we enjoy so much on this podcast, I guess I could say, because the Germans are very concerned about learning the weather. And they're at a geographic disadvantage for this, because weather systems go from west to east in the northern hemisphere, at least our part of the northern hemisphere. So if they want to know what kind of weather is coming for their U-boats to deal with, or their aircraft flying against those Arctic convoys, they need some kind of weather stations and sensors in places where they don't have a very big presence. So even in Canada, they actually, in the Canadian Arctic, they sent U-boats and put little weather monitoring devices up there and so on. Well, they do this in Norway too. They go to Spitzbergen in fall 1944 by U-boat. There are no satellites, of course, or anything, so you need to have these weather stations. And so they drop off these like weather scientists who are just hanging out on the island with their instruments, saying what the weather is up there. That becomes a problem in May 1945 because, the home base in Germany tells them, hey, the war's ending, but then it goes dark. And they're stuck there up on this island, and there's nobody home anymore in Berlin or wherever their main communication was in Germany. I'm not sure if it was in Berlin or not. So they're kind of cut off and don't know what to do. So eventually, in September 1945, a Norwegian ship reaches them and they surrender to this Norwegian ship. As far as I know, they are the last Germans to surrender up there on Spitzbergen, a bunch of weather scientists.
So they say, exactly.
A very anticlimactic, but anticlimatic might work.
Ooh,
Dad
very
joke
good.
pun
Very
lovers
good,
out there.
very
There's
good.
one for you. End to the Germans in World War II with the surrender of some weather scientists.
Yeah,
it's
not particularly heroic, is it? And it's not even like the Japanese when you have the last survivors coming out in the 1970s
Right.
out of the jungle. So it's as you say, a bit of an anticlimax. And again, if you want to continue with that tension, that's got absolutely nothing to do, of course, with Norway, dear listeners.
Yes.
But I think the whole question of these weather stations is really interesting. And of course, the Allies had the upper hand here for the reason you explained. The weather moves from west to east. And that is Allied-controlled territory. Just think about D-Day, the famous story of the Allies knowing that there is this very, very short window on the 5th or 6th of June where you can actually land. The Germans say, well, no, that's not happening. So Rommel being told you can go and celebrate your wife's birthday because the weather is going to be too bad. And when you look at the Allied weather stations, it's also interesting, again, complete tangent now, that quite a few of these were actually in the Republic of Ireland, because in particular the British put a little bit of, shall we say, pressure onto the Irish government.
Friendly advice.
So they were, yeah, exactly. So they were able and allowed to open weather stations on the west coast of Ireland. And that, of course, is what gives them the upper hand. So the one German weather station at Spitzbergen is a great story. Didn't really do an awful lot. Probably not, because how many German planes and ships do you have there in 1945? But again, if you're posted there, you just do as you're told and you keep reporting the weather. I mean, it's quite, an interesting one. And you're absolutely right. As far as I know as well, that's the last German, well, shall we say, unit to surrender. I mean, that's another interesting little story or question. So the end of the war, we looked at it in the podcast, some of these examples of where and how and when troops surrender. Quite a few of them actually after the official surrender, but this one is the last one as far as we know.
Indeed. Right. Which brings us to, let's say, the home front. Unless, Matthias, you've got any other tales of daring do of military operations. If not, I think it makes sense to round up the episode talking a bit about the home front, so to speak, the experience in Norway, this idea of resistance, this idea of the Quisling government and so on. Do you want to get us started, get the ball rolling on that?
Well, I can perhaps start again with what I always do with the German side. So Germany's taken over. So how do you organize a country like this now? Well, first of all, it's different from other countries you've conquered so far. Norway is not Poland, for example, at least in the German understanding, because these people are all Aryans, they're Scandinavian, so you can work with them. So from a pure racial point of view, they are pure. So you want them as your friends. How do you do this? How do you not then cheese them off so that they work with you? And that's difficult. So what they come up with is different ideas. The first problem, of course, that they have is, and we talked about this in the previous episode, is that the king and the government, they managed to get away. So the idea was to basically arrest them, perhaps even turn them, perhaps even leave the king in place and say, you now work for us. So here's the puppet regime. So you can do that and fine, and you just take the orders from the Germans. That doesn't happen. So they now have, you might say, in a way, a bit of a problem, because how can you now organize all of this? And again, it gets very, very, you might say, very difficult and confusing, because you've got lots of different groups playing there and different individuals. I'm trying to cut a slightly long story short now. So the Germans try to install a new government. The first thing that happens is that Quisling, we talked about him beforehand, so the famous person Quisling, and I'm going to go into a bit more detail on him later on, I guess. The day of the invasion, he declares that he is now the prime minister. So he says, the government has fallen, my party, which exists, which at that stage has about 2,000 members, it's a mini splinter party, fascist party, we are now in charge. And even the Germans look at this and think, we know what, this is not how it works. Because, well, first of all, you didn't ask us, and we can see you don't really have the support of the population. So they sack him again, to then install another regime, and that basically has 13, what you might say, ministers, but really they're just taking orders from the Germans. And that stays in place for some time. They declare, so this government, in inverted commas, and the Germans declare that the other government the real government that sits in London, and also the king, they are gone. He is forcefully abdicated, he's thrown out, and the government is declared null and void, because now look at this, they've got a new government, and isn't that great? That, again, doesn't really work for all sorts of reasons, because the Norwegians don't really play ball. And again, to cut a relatively long and complicated story short, in the end, in 1942, the Germans then decide, you know what, all this is all a bit pointless. So Quisling, you come back, and we make you, so to speak, the prime minister of Norway. And he, together with the German authority that is there, authorities that are there, then governs the country. So the Germans have a divided structure, like they have in lots of countries when they do this. You have a military strand, and you've got the more, let's say, the normal political strand. On the military side, the military commander in Norway for most of the time, all the way till late 1944, is a chap called Nikolaus von Falkenhorst. We talked about him last time. So he is the general who is responsible for the war plan for the invasion. So he does all that, it's a success, and he stays there. And you have, in inverted commas, a normal military regime. The Germans are trying to be relatively, what's the best word, nice, lenient, cooperative, again, because they think, you know what, these are Norwegians, we can work with them, we want them as our friends. And also, to be perfectly honest, the Norwegian resistance, we'll talk about it later, does not really worry the Germans too much, for reasons we can talk about later when we talk about resistance. And he's, of course, in charge of all the military installations, and that not only means the main areas where you have the garrisons, but also, for example, convoys, making sure that the roads are kept open. So it's a bit more than just a normal military commander. So he stays there. He stays till late 1944. At that stage, an Austrian guy takes over, Rendulic, who comes with his troops from further east, from Finland. He takes over. Falkenhorst is out. What's interesting, what happens to him then, is put on trial after the war for two things. So first of all, it's the shooting of and the arrest and then shooting of Norwegian civilians. And in particular, it is the commando order, which had been issued by Hitler, which said whenever you capture commando troops, British commando troops, these should not be treated as normal prisoners of war. They should be interrogated and then either, as the terminology went in those days, dealt with on the spot, i.e. shot, or handed over to the SD, the Gestapo, the secret state police, and the fate would be the same. So he does that a number of times. He hands over some of these British commandos, hands them over, and kind of willingly, so to speak, you might say, takes part in the execution of them. So for that, he's put on trial and he's sentenced to death by the Allies after World War II. Now, what's interesting is he then gets someone else coming in, and that's a chap called Sven Hedin. He's an explorer, and he actually speaks out in favor of Falkenhorst because, hang on. That's okay, he did that, and not good. However, what also happened was that in one of these incidents where a number of Norwegian people were put on trial and were supposed to get shot, well, he actually, because of espionage, he basically said, no, he reported back to Berlin and said it was all very, very different. So he prevents the execution of some of these people. So people speak of up to 10 people. And Hedin, who was involved in that as well, he tells this story to the Allies and they're, okay, you know what? Okay, so it's a quid pro quo, so to speak, and they convert the sentence, and then he's locked up for a number of years, and then I think in 1953, if I'm not mistaken, I think July 53, he's then released and lives out the rest of the days in Germany. So interesting again how all this develops. So he's the military wing. You then have, of course, the political wing, and that's a very different story. So you have you basically have two people. One is the real political leader, and then you've got the police there as well, so the SD. The political leader is a chap called Josef Terboven. He joins the Nazi party very, very early on. He takes part in the Hitler Putsch in 1923. He becomes a member of the Reichstag in 1930, then stays a member of the Reichstag. He is, you might say, in the inner circle in the early days of the Nazi party. And that is because he marries the former secretary of Joseph Goebbels. So when he marries her, of course, Goebbels and Hitler, they come along, and I think Hitler's even the best man. Hitler and Goebbels are both the best man. So you can see there's a bit of an interesting development here. And he's, of course, is a party member, so he's not a military man. So and he is then, after the occupation, he is sent to Norway. And again, the idea to begin with was to win over the Norwegians, that they would come on the German side. Difficult, because in one of the reports it is said that the Norwegians are, of course, Aryans. So from a racial point of view, they are very, very good. However, they're also, and the quote is, notorious Democrats. And that is a problem. So you can't work with Democrats. So that's difficult. So you can see as the occupation then develops and continues, that the regime gets a bit harsher and harsher and harsher. So they're tightening the screws a little bit. And it's basically mainly to do with Terboven, who really is the political leader. So he, together with Quisling, is the political duo, is the political leadership, you might say. Well, then it's interesting what happens at the end of the war. So he goes to a manor house, and that's called Skaugum. Again, apologies for my pronunciation. That is very, very famous because that is the home, the seat of the royal family. So it's like a country house, like a manor. That's his place while he is there. And he goes there and he says, you know what? Okay, the war is lost. And so he is sacked on the 7th of May, 1945. So basically the day when the war's over, because in the West, the Germans surrender. And on the next day, on the 8th of May, 1945, he goes into basically in a bunker. So he gets completely hammered and drunk with another chap, Wilhelm Redies. I'm going to talk about him very briefly in a minute, because he is the higher SS and police head in Norway. So he goes there and they're both completely drunk, and Terboven has had 50 kilograms of explosives put into this particular room where they're getting drunk. And he then decides that's a very good idea to just blow himself up. And you can imagine when you blow yourself up with 50 kilograms of explosive, there's not a lot left. And that's exactly what you find. The remains, not many, are then buried in his hometown in Essen in the Ruhr area. So he's gone. The other guy, very, very briefly, because I know, again, I've been talking for quite some time now, is the main police guy. Again, there's shifts and changes a bit because the first guy gets there, well, he dies quite early on, so I'm not bothering with him. So the famous person is a chap called Friedrich Wilhelm Otto Redies. He's born in 1900. So like most of these relatively senior Nazi guys, he's actually quite young. That's one of these interesting stories that you find, particularly everything to do with the SS. Normal kind of, you might say, upbringing, joins the Nazi party again relatively early on, tries to become member of the Landtag, so the local parliament or the Prussian parliament. That fails, but then all sorts of other stuff happens. I'm not going to give you all the detail. In the end, he is then in charge of a number of SS Totenkopf units. So these are the guys who, to begin with, guard the concentration camps. Later on, they also do some fighting, mainly on the Eastern Front. So you can see where we are leading with this. He then gets close to Herbert Lange. He's a relatively famous SS guy. It's all about extermination of Jews and the way you do it, and the T4 operation as well. He's involved in this. So this is the mentally impaired people that they kill as well. So you can see that he's a proper embodiment, so to speak, of this, the nasty side of this particular regime. And then in June 1940, he is then sent to Norway, where he stays. Again, all sorts of interesting things happening there. So he contributes, of course, to the Holocaust. The number of Jews is relatively small. Quite a few managed to get away, get into Sweden. He managed to get his hands on the rest of them. Some of them get deported. What is interesting from this German point of view at that time, again, the racial purity. How can you do this? There was a thing in Germany called Lebensborn, where you get those people who are classed as A-Aryans. They should breed, and he includes the other Norwegians in there, because you have between 12 and 15,000, as far as I know, children born, German fathers, Norwegian women. So how do you use this? You can see where all this is going. And then he stays there till the end of the war. And he has this drinking session with the Terboven guy, but he doesn't want to wait until Terboven decides to blow everybody up. So he just before that happens, he decides to shoots himself in the head. He is dead. And Terboven then, as I said, blows himself up in the same room where you find the body of this Redies guy. And again, because of the explosion, not a lot left of him. So quite a weird way of finishing their personal stories, if that's the right way, if that's what you want to call it.
I'll leave you to take up the story of Quisling in a moment, but since you mentioned the resistance, I thought it might make sense for us to just explore that a little bit here. Now, I don't want to make out that Norway is Yugoslavia, that Norway is, the Soviet Union as far as resistance is concerned. It's a different situation there. The population is very small. It's not very dense. There's a very, very high proportion of German troops in the country. If you think about 300 or 400,000 Germans, that's almost 10% of the entire population of the country. So it makes things a little trickier. And of course, if they're not being as repressive, then you're going to have also a little bit less resistance. There are some Norwegians who volunteer for either racial, ideological reasons or Some volunteer for perceived anti-communist ideological reasons. So they volunteer for the Waffen-SS. There are a couple of famous or well-known Waffen-SS divisions that are named like Viking and Northland, Nordland in German. And there are a few thousand Norwegians who are involved in those. Some of them fight in the Battle of Berlin. That's how I became familiar a bit more with some of their operations. But you do also have Norwegians who resist. And this happens in different ways, as resistance usually goes. There are some, let's say, democratically minded. We talked about Norwegian Democrats and how the Germans were no fans of them. Well, obviously the feeling is mutual, because you do have some sort of patriotic, democratically minded Norwegians who decide, well, we're going to engage in some relatively minor acts of sabotage here and there, or we're going to try and collect some intel and give it to Allied agents. The US actually sends an OSS agent, or a few, to help the Norwegian resistance and to work with them. And one of them is a future CIA director, William Colby, oddly enough, as interesting as that is. But you have these little Norwegian organizations. You have one, for example, called XU. It's run by Norwegians. It's got a lot of students, university students who participate in it. And that's one of these low-key organizations that provides some intel to the Allies. You also have the saboteurs. Probably the most famous one is a man by the name of Gunnar Sonsteby. And again, apologies for the pronunciation. So he later is decorated by the Norwegian state, becomes a famous kind of hero of the resistance for being a part of one of the organizations that is trying to commit some acts of sabotage to damage the German war effort. There's a communist-minded group, which is also quite common in resistance, of course, at least once the Soviet Union joins the war. Before that, communists were not really fans of fighting against the Germans that much in many places because of the Nazi-Soviet pact, but that changes after 1941. So Norwegian communists who resist are mostly part of a group called the Oswald Group. And I suppose the most famous act of resistance is probably to do with a heavy water plant. So Norsk Hydro is involved in energy production. They have storage tanks of something called heavy water, which is a molecularly different variation of water that is important for research on atomic topics and potentially an atomic weapon for Germany. Germany's program was never really that serious and never really that advanced, but for any research they wanted to do, this reserve of heavy water in Norway was quite important, and the resistance damages that, if memory serves, with British help in that operation. But I'll let you say a few more words about that if you wish. I just wanted to mention, before I toss the ball back to you, that Sweden, normally we talk about Sweden as being kind of neutral on paper, but actually, yes, they did allow some Jews to escape to Sweden, especially Danish Jews, but not only. But they were also, not kind of friendly-ish towards the Germans, or at least very accommodating towards the Germans as well. In this case, there's a check mark, I think, to the Allied side for Sweden because they allowed the Norwegian resistance to train on their territory and crisscross back across the border. So you have these Norwegian refugees, some of whom flee the Germans to Sweden. And then in those refugee camps, there are training operations that the Swedes allow. In all, 1,400 Norwegian resistors get killed by the Germans. And interestingly, there's a fairly high proportion of women. 250 women are killed among those 1,400. The most famous massacre, as far as I know, in my reading for this episode, occurs at a village called Telavag in 1942, where the Germans kill a bunch of villagers because they say you are harboring and helping resistors. So there is definitely a harsh side to the occupation. There is an active resistance. It's not on the scale of Eastern Europe, but that is explainable historically. It's not just a moral question. There's a historical context for that. Matthias, fill us in. What are the gaps that you want to fill in the resistance story? if any?
I don't think there are any gaps in that resistance story, but I think we also need to look at the other side, so the collaboration a little bit more. So unless you want to say anything else about the resistance, I might just
That was my resistance snippet.
So I'm going to swing the pendulum over to the other side. And we already mentioned the one individual and you might say, the group that is, of course, that are very, very famous, infamous when it comes to this. And that, of course, in this case here is Vidkun Quisling. And, of course, it's the SS. And I'm going to unpack this a little bit more. You already started to talk about this, but let's have a slightly more in-depth look at all of this. Quisling, of course, well, the name, everyone's familiar with the name Quisling now because of what happened there. So let me tell you a little bit about his particular background. So Vidkun Quisling is, of course, he's Norwegian. He's born there. So he is the son of a priest. His father's also a genealogist. And this family, you might say proper, perhaps middle class, you might say, but very well respected. So they're part of the established circle in Norway, so in this part of Norway where they come from. So he then joins the military, and this is quite interesting, I find, because he goes to the military academy and he leaves the academy with the best results ever achieved by anybody attending the military academy. So he is good. He is good at what he does. He's clever, he's eloquent, he is not a stupid man, because quite often we say everyone who's got anything to do with Nazis or National Socialism and collaborates, well, they're all complete idiots. Well, he is not. He's obviously very, very, very clever. You can also see how this then runs through the next few years. So in 1922, he becomes someone who works with Fridtjof Nansen, who goes to the Soviet Union as part of a diplomatic mission. He then is actually a diplomat in Moscow from 1927 to, I think, 1929, if I'm not mistaken. And he also meets his wife there. So his wife is Russian. And so from the 1930s, he afterwards said himself, because of the experiences in the Soviet Union, he then looks for some sort of alternative, and he's beginning to get closer to right-wing movements, to fascism, what have you. In 1931, he becomes the war minister. And in 1933, he then decides to leave the government. So he's not someone who just appears out of nowhere. So he's part of the Norwegian, you might say, establishment. Very, very, very much so. In 1933, he then founds his new movement, his new party. And again, apologies for my pronunciation. The National Samling, which I would translate as the National Collection. So basically, it also means national unity. And you can see that's it's in the terminology. This is, to cut a very long and very complex story short, it's a fascist, basically a fascist party, looking towards Germany, looking towards Hitler, and organized in a similar way. It's very small, a bit like the Nazi party in the early 1920s. It doesn't really kick off. So the first election, 4 months after it's been founded, I think they get something like 27,000 votes. It's about 2% of the overall vote. So they're not overly successful, you might say. And of course, this really then changes only when the Germans take over. And I already mentioned it's Quisling. First thing he does when the Germans invade is that he makes himself the prime minister, basically the German second again. Later on, they bring him back, and then they work together with him very, very closely. Hitler apparently disliked him, mainly because he said, well, this guy is completely irrelevant because he's not successful. How can a guy who's got 2,000 members before we invaded and had 27,000 votes, 2%, how can he speak for Norway? So if anything, we're probably going to cheese off the Norwegians even more if we go together with him. So Hitler was not a huge fan of Quisling. However, in the end, they decided to use him because at least they had to sort some sort of links into Norway itself. He then, at the end of the whole story, so he's then arrested. He's got his own little manor house, and that is named Gimle. And that's interesting if you find these things interesting because it's linked to Nordic mythology. So Gimle is a place where after Ragnarok, so the twilight of the gods, that's where the good guys, the survivors, go to assemble. So you can see he saw himself as one of the good guys. He's then put on trial, and he is condemned to death, and he is then executed on the 24th of October 1945. That decision caused a little bit of unease even in Norway, because the death penalty had been reintroduced after the end of the war. People say, well, say this typical thing, say he committed all these things before the death penalty was introduced. So should we actually condemn him to death? Yes or no? But in the end, they decided that was the right thing to do. And he is then assassinated and he's gone. And of course, his name is the synonym for all these traitors, people working with other groups. Dear listeners, you have heard all this before. And linked in some ways to this, of course, is the other group that I already mentioned, and you already mentioned them as well. That is, of course, let's call them the collaborators. I mean, first of all, you've got civilian collaborators as well. I'm just going to give you a few numbers in a minute. But of course, the famous one is of course, the SS. So the Nazis very actively trying to encourage people to join the Waffen-SS, again, because you've got this racial, this Aryan idea, so they would fit in very, very nicely. It doesn't really work as well as the Germans think it should and could have done. So, for example, by the end of 1941, and I always have to look at these figures here, they only have been able to attract 1,883 volunteers for the Waffen-SS. So that's not an awful lot if you think about that. They then do more things, and you already talked about the division Viking, for example. So in August 1941, the SS division Viking had only 294 Norwegians. That's it. And even these regiments that they form, so the Norge that you already mentioned, which has Norway in its name, does not consist fully of Norwegians. So they've got lots of other nations there as well, but the name is there, the link is there. So you do have a little bit, of course, of support for the German side here. The Germans respect the Norwegians. They think they're very, very good soldiers. They think they're very brave, very calm, very quiet. The other way around, most of the time, against a bit of a broad brush, the Norwegians didn't really like the Germans because they said they were kind of pretending to be the masters of the world in Europe, and the way they were spoken to by the Germans, they didn't like that at all.
Shocking.
So, we're shocking, exactly. So, but there are lots of accounts of this. There are even a number of incidents where Norwegians try to basically desert and get home, which then sets in motion some countermeasures by the Germans. So in 1944, Hitler actually orders the arrest of all Norwegian officers. So not in the Waffen-SS, but Norwegian officers back home, because they can see the relationship is souring. But you have this. And of course, you already talked about the Nordland division. That is probably the famous one, of which the Norge regiment is part. And you talked about, so these guys are the ones that also fight then, for example, in Berlin. So the final days of the Third Reich. This is why this division becomes very famous and becomes very well known. They also have a Norwegian ski battalion, for example, that is used in the 6th SS Mountain Division Nord. That gets completely destroyed in the late 1944, early 1945. So that basically brings the whole thing to an end. So there is support here, but not as much as the Germans would have liked or would have hoped for. What you do find, however, is you also find collaboration on the civilian side. Again, we don't really have figures because no one really wants to talk about this after the war. Well, of course, I'm a collaborator. I work with the Germans. It's not really what you do. You would stress the other side, that you worked against them. But we do have some figures. So, for example, we already talked about Quisling. He's sentenced to death and executed. More than 14,000 Norwegians were sentenced to time in prison by their own courts for collaborating with the Germans. And in total, 25 people were executed by the Norwegians themselves for having collaborated with the Germans. So you do find that as well. In total, when you go back to the military side, you're looking at around 6,000 Norwegians that joined the Waffen-SS to fight against the Soviet Union. So the numbers aren't all that great. Again, 6,000 here. About 14,000 that are then sentenced to time in prison. You can see again the dynamic that you find here is an interesting one as well. So I think that's an aspect that also needs to be remembered, because it's always very, very easy, isn't it, to say no one was a collaborator. We all were all in the resistance, which of course is again an argument created after 1945. The reality was a little bit different. And particular, even though the numbers here are relatively small, but generally speaking, broad brush, this whole idea of a fight against Bolshevism, fight against the Soviet Union, in many countries was far more attractive than a lot of people would admit to after 1945. That's another tangent, and that's another podcast, I think. So maybe one
Indeed.
or two episodes on this. There we are.
I would love to do an episode on propaganda themes, and well, we could do one on the foreign Waffen-SS at some point as well. There's a great book that came out a couple of years ago about that, edited by Jochen Böhler, I think it was. But a very interesting book. Santa Claus gifted it to me at some stage.
Very good. There's also another very good one. That's where I got my the information from, and it's only available in German, unfortunately. To listeners, it's by a chap called Rolf Dieter Müller. He's one of the leading historians of the Second World War, worked for a very long time at the Military History Research Institute in Potsdam. And the book's called If You're Able to Read German, An der Seite der Wehrmacht. And so he goes through all the other countries that send contingents together with the Wehrmacht or with the Waffen-SS or in whatever shape or form to fight on the Eastern Front. So whether these were volunteers in the Waffen-SS or like the Italians sending their own divisions. Really fascinating because, again, tangent, but about a third of the troops fighting on the Eastern Front against Bolshevism weren't actually German. So again, something that people don't really talk about anymore because that was conveniently written out of history for obvious and very clear reasons. But that is another huge tangent, and maybe we need to rein it back in here and come back to
Indeed,
Norway,
the tangents, they always risk getting the better of us. So I think that we've now done reasonable justice. Listeners, you can let us know in the comments, especially if we have any listeners from Norway. Let us know, what did you think about this 3-part series about Norway in the Second World War? It was voted for by our very own listeners as a topic they wanted to learn more about. If you out there hearing this now or watching this now also want to be able to vote on future topics of future episodes, you can do that by joining our community at bothsidesofthewire.com. If you do that, you will also, in addition to being able to vote on topics, you can get access to exclusive content in our War Room section of the website. And you can get a free trial for that by using the code Deep Dark Woods. So if you want to support the podcast, if you like what we do and you want to have a say in what we do here, then check out bothsidesofthewire.com. Otherwise, that was it for Norway, folks. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.
Audacity is recording. I think we're in business, correct?
Indeed.
I hope. He says confidently.
Yeah.